Hey, everybody, welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast, where we discuss the philosophy and skills of traveling light so you can experience the outdoors with more comfort, more safety, and more enjoyment. I'm Ryan Jordan.
And I'm Andrew Marshall, and we're your hosts on this lifelong journey of doing more with less as we venture into wild places.
Look for me in the mountains where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind.
Today's episode is about synthetic insulation, where we're going to dive deeper into the nature and purpose of synthetic insulation for apparel. We're going to talk about how synthetic insulation is made, take some questions from our listeners, and interview an Alaskan adventurer, Max Neale, who just completed a monumental review for Backpacking Light that includes his State of the Market report on synthetic insulating jackets. But first, let's set some context and build a little bit of a foundation. When we talk about synthetic insulation, what we're really talking about is the fiber stuffing that sits between two pieces of fabric that gives a garment or a sleeping bag its loft and its warmth. The two most common categories of this so-called high loft insulation are down and synthetic. Down is a very common, very durable material. Synthetics are used typically in situations where you're looking for better moisture management. We'll dive deeper into that as we go. So what exactly is synthetic insulation? At its core, synthetic insulation is simply a collection of single-stranded fibers manufactured from polymers that are usually comprised of acrylic, polyolefin, or polyester, polyester being probably the most common in the outdoor industry. So let's talk a little bit how these fibers are made. It's kind of a three-step process. The first step is called polymerization, and that's the formation of macromolecules in a chemical process that involves converting or dissolving or melting all these molecules into this liquid. And then that liquid passes through what's called a spinneret in a process called spinning. And it's a lot like how a spider spins its web. There's an organ in a spider called a spinneret. It has lots of little tiny holes in it. And out of those holes come the silk used to spin a spider web. And in chemical manufacturing, a spinneret is a device that's much like this. It has hundreds of tiny holes in it. Think of it sort of like a pasta making machine. So you pass this polymer liquid through it, and out come these little strands of polymer spaghetti that are then cooled down or otherwise chemically stabilized to form the solid fibers. And then you can control the fiber diameter simply with the diameter of the holes in this spinneret device. And then finally, the final step of this whole process is that these fibers are laid down most commonly in a non-woven or loosely woven and sometimes a twisted construction into what we call a batt, B-A-T-T. This is the actual form of the insulation that we then sew into our garments or sleeping bags. The batt can then have various properties, including thickness and fiber density and things like that. So if we consider the individual filament fiber diameter and its molecular makeup, and then the thickness and fiber density of the batt, these are all the key characteristics that allow textile designers to control insulating ability and moisture management in the insulation itself. So yeah, there's a primer on how this stuff is all made.
So Ryan, have there been any advances in any of this technology? Is this the same technique that's been going on for 30 years, or have there been, new ways of doing this?
I think the manufacturing itself of synthetic fibers is at its core the same that it's always been. Not a lot of advances in how this stuff is actually extruded. The advances have come in a couple different areas. One is in the quality of the polymers that the chemists are designing, and this is where there's definitely room for improvement. Right now, we're using the same stuff we've always used because it's very cheap, and we've got it kind of dialed in to a point where you can produce durable fibers. Now, with polymer chemistry, you can go in and change the chemistry of these fibers to make them stiffer or softer. And there has been a trend, at least in bedding and outdoor insulation, that we're looking for softer fibers, more down-like fibers. And so there's definitely been some advances there. The other advances is in we're limited in this technology by the spinneret design. And so what we end up is single-stranded fibers. Now, if we're going to make a fiber that looks and behaves more like down, which is a branched fiber, more like a little tiny tree or a shrub, then we don't really have the manufacturing technology yet to create branched fibers like this. So that is definitely an area of R&D that I know some manufacturers are working on and having various degrees of success with. But we're still, there's a disconnect between the physical structure of down that we're trying to mimic and what we're capable of extruding in a polymer fiber.
And why is it that the manufacturers are headed towards that down-like structure? What about that structure is beneficial?
If you take an equivalent weight of down and an equivalent weight of synthetic, the same weight of down has many, many more branches to it. And so you have a fiber structure that's almost mesh-like in nature. And so it lofts better, it's softer, it entraps more air, there's more surface area for moisture to be absorbed to it, which can be in a synthetic fiber, that could be a huge benefit, because then you can maintain fiber structure at higher levels of moisture than you could with single-stranded insulations. So definitely some opportunity to create an insulating structure that entraps more air with down, and that's really what we're trying to do.
Yeah. So why would you choose synthetic over down?
I think the general assumption is that you want an insulation that is better at managing moisture. And so down has this bad rap to it that if you have just a little bit of moisture in it, the whole thing collapses, which of course isn't true. But what is true is that there's a level of moisture that is absorbed into down that you dramatically start losing loft. And that's because down fibers tend to be more hydrophilic. They absorb moisture better than a synthetic fiber. And so as that moisture is absorbed, the little condensation droplets start sticking together, and then the down cluster collapses on itself and it can no longer hold air. So synthetic fibers don't have that property quite dramatically. So you get absorption of water on the synthetic fibers, and the synthetic fibers maintain their structure and don't absorb as much. And so synthetics generally maintain their loft in response to equivalent amounts of moisture better than down. So I think people choose synthetic garments or sleeping bags when they're in environments that are high moisture and very difficult to manage that moisture by drying your stuff in the sun and things like that.
Yeah. When I was just a baby hiker doing my first through hike on the AT, I bought a down quilt because of the compressibility and the lightness and the warmth. But of course, on the East Coast, it rains all the time. And I basically had one long 4-month anxiety attack about trying to keep my down quilt dry and lofty. And even to this day, sometimes I use a sleep app, a noise generator, and it has a setting called rain on a tent, which I was really excited about. But sometimes it will make me wake up in the middle of the night, clutching for my blanket, trying to keep it from touching the sides of my tent.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, I think rain is obviously the big fear driver for most hikers, because and with this new wave or this new trend towards ultralight shelters, which aren't as bomber, so to speak, as traditional double wall tents, you end up with rain splashing under the tent fly, or maybe you're using a tarp and rain's coming in through the side with wind and things like that. So there's more opportunities for people to get their stuff wet. So, but it's not limited to rain. I mean, I live in the Rockies and it's dry here, and everybody says, well, down is the only way to go out here. And I kind of disagree with that, because you have to look at it all in context. So in the winter or fringe season, when temperatures are, kind of in that 25 to 40 degree range, your body still emits an enormous amount of moisture. And then it hits this point in your insulation, whether you're wearing a jacket or you're lying in a sleeping bag, that's cold. And then that evaporated moisture condenses and accumulates as liquid water in your garment. And that's another case where synthetics really shine over down, is in that wet, cold kind of environment.
Right. So to summarize, kind of even just using a down product can cause it to lose loft just from being on your body.
Yeah. And that's the thing I always try to think about is, okay, out of the box in the store, and you put a down bag or a down garment next to a synthetic garment, and you look at the down garment, you think that looks awesome. It's toasty, it's fluffy and lofty. And then you get it out into the real world in a cold, moist environment, and it doesn't take much moisture for that down garment to start to lose quite a bit of loft. And that's the place where synthetics really shine, is that with small amounts of moisture, synthetics lose very little loft. And with small amounts of moisture, ultralight down garments can really lose a lot of loft.
What about from a sustainability standpoint? There's been a lot of talk in the industry lately about sustainably sourcing down. Are synthetics more sustainable from a green standpoint?
I will tell you what other manufacturers have told me, and that there's definitely a push towards the use of recycled plastics for new polymer extrusion. So they will source as their raw plastics a recycled source, and then use that in their manufacturing process. Now, obviously, you can't take a soda pop bottle and turn it into a synthetic garment without introducing quite a bit of energy into the process. So I don't really know how it all works out from an energy balance standpoint, but there might be something to it. I haven't thought about that side of it a lot. The side of it that I have thought about is it's well known or well assumed among people that synthetics don't last as long as down. And there's definitely some truth to that. They do break down faster, especially in response to compression and use in wet conditions and things like that. So if a synthetic jacket is only going to last you 1 or 2 seasons, especially if you aren't attentive to caring for it properly, then you're talking about a sustainability issue that's a little more severe in my eyes. So, a good down jacket can last many, many years before the down fails, usually through absorption of body oils. And a synthetic will fail due to loss of loft in the insulation much faster. So, if you look at a down jacket and say, okay, this is going to last me 10 years versus a synthetic jacket, which might last you 2 years of the same kind of use, then you're looking at 5 synthetic jackets versus 1 down jacket. Then you're looking at a sustainability equation that's a little more, it's easier to wrap my head around when I look at it that way.
Right. So it's definitely a downside. One of the other downsides, of course, is that synthetic has a lower warmth to weight ratio, which is a big deal if you're looking at shedding ounces.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's always been where high quality or high fill down has shined. Synthetics in the way they're currently manufactured will never match that. Although there's a new jacket on the market, it's the Patagonia Micropuff, and it's a new type of insulation that actually looks and behaves more like down. It's synthetic insulation. And it is almost as warm as the equivalent fill of down. And it's a remarkable execution of synthetic insulation. So I think advances in manufacturing and fabric specs will close that gap a little bit, at least for the ultralight jackets that are thinly insulated. But for the most part, what we have available today is not going to be as warm as a down jacket.
Well, what about compressibility? The conventional wisdom is that synthetic just isn't as compressible as down. But I think some people argue that it actually is. It just gets more damaged at that same level of compressibility.
Yeah, I mean, you could take a lightweight down jacket, let's say a 12-ounce down jacket, and compress it to the size of a grapefruit, and store it in your pack, and then bring it out that night, and it's going to puff up right back to where it was. If you tried to do that with a 12-ounce synthetic jacket, you could still get it to the size of a grapefruit, but you're probably going to damage those polymer fibers through overcompression. So there's definitely a usability issue where people need to treat their synthetics with a bit more care so they don't compress it to the point where they're damaging the loft and shortening the life of their jacket.
So where is synthetic insulation used? The first category is in apparel. So you're talking about jackets, pants, and mittens are the most common categories. I think jackets probably out of those three are the most common. And then, of course, you have sleeping bags and quilts, and then insulated sleeping pads.
Yeah, the sleeping pad category is fairly new, but the last few years, manufacturers of these they're just thicker air-filled pads, and instead of the traditional Thermarest model where you have a pad filled with air and open cell foam, now you have pads that look more like air mattresses, and they have blown in or batted synthetic insulating fibers, and in some cases even down fibers, and they comprise part of the insulative ability of the sleeping pad. And so they're becoming more common in winter air mattresses, and yeah, it's turning out to be a pretty effective way to use synthetic insulation.
So I hadn't heard that. How many ounces of weight are we talking about adding to something like that?
Well, you've got flexibility here. So the manufacturers that are doing this right now, the pads are generally 4 to 6 ounces heavier than their uninsulated counterparts. So you can assume that part of that is certainly, the blown in fibers or batting of synthetic insulation.
So with all that in mind, let's introduce our guest and talk specifically about the type of lightweight synthetic insulated jackets used by wilderness travelers.
So our guest today is someone who understands how to suffer well. He's a backpacker, pack rafter, ski mountaineer, and alpinist, and often combines these modes of travel into multi-sport expeditions spanning hundreds of miles across snowy and glaciated mountain ranges. He calls Anchorage, Alaska home, and like any respectable Alaskan adventurer, has enjoyed some incredible success in the mountains as well as some truly epic failures. He has been a regular contributor to backpackinglight.com and is the author of our new state-of-the-market review of synthetic insulated jackets. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Max Neale. Max, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So, Max, first let's talk about suffering. You have this knack, it seems, for planning expeditions that seem just a little out of reach, and it seems like you're okay with it. Can you tell us about a trip where the suffering you endured was just a little bit more than what you bargained for?
Sure. So first, regarding trips that are a little bit out of reach, I enjoy an element of uncertainty, and I feel that compared to others who have come before us, there's very little uncertainty nowadays. We have a plethora of information to inform trips. We have this incredible lightweight gear that makes them a lot easier and more comfortable. We have electronic trip planning resources, all this spatial data, Google Earth, digital elevation models, GPS apps with imagery on our phones. So I like to go some places where there's a little bit less information on that, just to make it a little more challenging or a little bit more of a surprise. So in general, I like that. But yeah, a trip that was more than what we bargained for was this past spring. And that's myself and two friends tried to do a ski climbing trip in the St. Elias Range. We tried to traverse over Mount Logan, which is the largest mountain in the world. It's part of the Kewaunee National Park in the Yukon, surrounded by the world's largest nonpolar ice field. And so, we tried to climb up this ridge, go over the mountain and down, and then we would ski a long ways and then float out to a town. And we made it up the ridge to about 16,000 feet. It's like technical climbing with skis and a bunch of heavy stuff. And then my friend got high altitude cerebral edema and pulmonary edema, and we were rescued with 2 helicopters and my assessment is he almost died. So we learned a lot from that, just quite a lot. So I could go into the details, but I don't think that's really what we're here for. But I think that's an example of where we didn't have enough our communication was not very good. And we had kind of a plan A. Instead, we didn't have a plan B and a plan C. So if you don't have those, then doing anything except for what you set out for is a failure. So it was a good learning experience.
For our listeners' benefits, at what point did you know that things might start to go downhill?
Well, we tried to do this acclimatization mountain first, to try to ski that one. And he had an asthma attack up there. And at that point, I had a really bad feeling, but tried to suppress that. And we all more or less ignored some of the key indicators and then went on and up. And then with altitude things, they can hit really quickly. And that's what happened is we'd climbed this technical ridge for which it's incredibly difficult to descend 9,000 feet. And then we're at a point where, has maybe 10% of his physical and mental capacity. And at that point, it's, either rescue or do an epic descent and hopefully make it out of it.
And how did you guys come to the decision where you made the call that was like, okay, we're done, we got to go?
Well, his water bottle was not properly fastened that day, so it leaked, and his whole lower half of the sleeping bag was soaked. He also popped his sleeping pad. We didn't bring backups; we just brought new Extherms. So when we got into the tent, we felt like we needed to call for a rescue at that point. But then seeing that the pad and bag on top of all that, I think that was just icing on the cake. And then further, at that point, your brain just doesn't work. So he was saying, there's no way I want to be call for rescue. And, if you're saying that, if you aren't factoring risk into decision-making, then you are no longer part of decision-making if you can't include risk.
My experience has always been that the victim is probably the first one the victim needs to exit the decision-making process.
Obviously there's a point of danger to this. Otherwise you wouldn't do that. You're seeking out, risky expeditions. Do you have any kind of metric on how risky is too risky? Like, what are you looking for in your planning?
Well, now I'm interested in less risky things. I think there's an element I think that risk in some ways is commensurate with reward, or at least like challenge and effort is. So I think risk flows into that in some capacity, and I'm sure it's different for every person. But I've also done some other climbing where I was like, supposedly up to for like age 23 to 27 is maybe the most dangerous years, and if you make it past that, then you're good. I don't know if that's true, but that's what some climbers say. So there was some things I did up here when I first came up here in 2014 that we really didn't know what we were getting into. Like a big technical route on Denali and bad conditions. And, we really didn't know in retrospect what we were getting into compared to what I know now. And so, now I think a bit wiser and more able to truly assess the risks, having more experience.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about synthetic jackets. You just completed this monumental review of synthetic insulated jackets that is the culmination of more than 2 years of testing in what can only be described as pretty harsh environments, especially in the context of what most of us experience as ultralight backpackers down in the lower 48. How did you plan your testing strategy when you started this big of a project?
Well, one reason why I wanted to do this project was because I knew that I'd be doing a lot of outdoor trips and had access to friends here who are doing a lot of cutting edge stuff. So the actual testing strategy was, at least the field testing strategy was like, just do what we do. And then for the first part, I think over the first year, I tested like 13 jackets, and Luke Mell, who's a skier and wilderness traveler up here who gets out a lot, he used a bunch of them. He used all of the first round. So he and I met up a bunch of different times and conversed with them. And that was an interesting kind of partnership because I have quite a bit of background in gear testing and product stuff, and he has virtually none. but he gets out all the time. So it's interesting to see how what his thoughts were on these different jackets, and also how the process of using a large sample of products informed his decision making and changed his behavior.
Do you feel like he came into it with a different perspective, being someone who doesn't review gear for a living?
Yeah, he did have, I think he came in unbiased in that, like, he doesn't know anything about this particular fabric or the history of, Rab's play in synthetic and in active insulation jackets or any of that. So I think that's really useful. And also, what activities you do matters tremendously in terms of what is going to be best for your needs. And I appreciated that he does a lot of kind of, let's say, high output activities. So a lot of skiing in the winter, and, cross-country skiing with a heavy pack on, or backcountry skiing up mountains here. It's much higher output than just normal backpacking. So you really need air permeability, breathability really matters. So he basically just said, no way in hell am I using any of these low air permeability fabric jackets. Like, they just don't work for me. I need something that's breathable.
Because it's cold enough for him to need an insulating layer while he's on the move, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's either cold enough, or it's windy, or it's precipitating. Or the combination of those. And if you're going to carry one thing, it's nice to be able to wear that while you're moving too. So that, I'd used some of the active insulation jackets before then, and I kind of just wrote them off as this luxury tool. In testing another round with him and having conversations with him, it did really reopen my eyes to that category. And now I'm a huge fan of that category. But it's taken, a lot of experimentation and learning to be, to really appreciate them. And I think that they're phenomenal.
Well, let's circle back around and, just for the layperson, kind of talk about what the different categories are. You talk about windproof versus waterproof versus highly air permeable. Can you go into that?
So I think the average synthetic jacket or puffy jacket that anyone thinks of is going to have a more or less a windproof fabric when there's very low breathability. And the industry calls that air permeability. It's measured in cubic feet per minute. A lot of the tightly woven ones are close to 0 CFM, and then a highly air permeable fabric, like a very highly air permeable fabric that's used in an active insulation jacket, maybe like 120 or 130 CFM. I don't know how much just an average like base layer t-shirt is, but it's more than that. So then active insulation jackets have that highly air permeable fabric on the outside and on the inside. And the whole goal is to let heat and moisture out as you're moving. And it's not necessarily to maximize warmth or weight. It's just to be warm and be comfortable on the move. And then, other jackets are waterproof or almost waterproof. And I think that those are rarely worth purchasing. Then, of course, there's like jackets that mix combination of materials.
One of the benefits of active insulation is you're combining multiple functions into a single garment. And before these came on the market, I think what we all used traditionally for on the move active insulation in cold weather was a fleece top of some type covered with a wind shirt. And the problem with that system is, fleece inherently is a little bit restrictive, especially if you buy a fleece that is fit properly to you, and they tend to bind, especially when you add all these different layers together. So now you've got 3, 4, 5 layers on, and it's all of a sudden a very restrictive clothing system. And I think one of the things I really like about the active insulation jackets is that it feels so much more comfortable having one stretchy garment rather than 2, 3, 4 layers that it has the potential to replace. The other thing that with the fleece wind shirt system is that most wind shirts have similar air permeability to these windproof synthetic insulated jackets, and so you're banging your head against the breathability barrier again. And there's exceptions to that, like the Patagonia Airshed wind shirt and things like that. But I think this new wave of fabrics that has come out with this massive CFM rates really changes the game for these jackets. And it is definitely the core of what I'm using in the winter.
Let's just define CFM again, just for anyone listening in who's not familiar with that term.
It's cubic feet per minute. So you put a fabric or a combination of fabrics and materials together in a machine, and it measures how fast air or how much air moves through them. Ryan, do you have anything to add to that?
CFM is an advantage and it's a disadvantage. If you're looking to have something that is wind resistant, especially when you're stationary and you need to hold as much heat as possible in, you want a low CFM shell fabric on your insulated jacket. But if you're on the move and you need to spill body heat and condensation through the materials, then a high CFM jacket is pretty critical. And so that's where these active insulation jackets come into play.
Yeah. And one thing I want to add to your pitch for them earlier is the benefit of weather resistance, that you can be moving and that they're generally wind resistant enough if you're generating a lot of heat that you can be going and it's blowing hard and it's spitting snow, and the snow does not stick to your fleece. After you've used any active insulation jacket a lot, like at least the Patagonia ones, they do tend to pill up a little bit. So maybe a little bit of snow is going to stick to it, but just a little bit. Generally, they just blows right off. And that's a huge benefit. So you can, in many cases, be wearing one layer through a wide range of conditions when you're moving and when you're stopped.
They are very versatile in a wide range of conditions and a wide range of activity outputs as well. Well, let's ask you the question that I hate getting more than any other question, and the reason for that is because I can't pick just one, but I'm going to ask you, what was your favorite jacket reviewed and why?
So I think this changes depending on the activities that I'm doing. And so I think it's a little bit flexible, but right now I'm going to answer with the Patagonia Nano Air Light. So that's an active insulation jacket that's lightweight, and it's meant for, it's designed exclusively for climbers, like all the feature set. So it's just an anorak zipper. And the reason why you don't want a full zip with climbing is you can't really use it if your harness is over your full zip and snow's coming down, your jacket's going to be zipped up anyway. So yeah, it's meant for climbing, but it's about 10 ounces. I know you've used it. And I think it's kind of if I were to recommend one jacket for someone who's interested in getting a new synthetic insulated jacket, you probably already have a low air perm jacket, something where the fabrics are locked down. So if you want to try to experiment and try something new, I would recommend the Nano Air Light because it's just really different, and it could be excellent for someone, and or it could not. It depends on what you do. But for me, I think this is one of the ones that I've used most.
It's a complete game changer for me for winter conditions, and ironically, I'm wearing it right now. Stephanie and I went snowshoeing this morning. We've had a big storm come in, dumped in a couple feet of new snow. So I wore, temperatures are in the 20s and 30s today, and kind of partly cloudy, partly sunny, and quite a bit of wind. And so I wore this over a short sleeve wool t-shirt, and that's what I've been wearing all day for our hike, and it's awesome. I have this jacket on the majority of my wintertime activity while I'm on the move.
Yeah, I think it's basically the most comfortable, completely synthetic insulated jacket that's out there. It's so incredibly comfortable. One thing I wanted to say is, I think there's this question of how breathable should a synthetic insulated jacket be is an open question, and really depends on your physiology and physics and your activities, and that I in most cases for high output stuff, I don't think that a warmer jacket or a less air permeable jacket is really suitable for folks. It depends on what you do. And for some folks, you may want something that's even more breathable than a Nano Air Light if you're really going hard. But to choose one, I'd go for that.
There's a traditional assumption, at least in the ultralight backpacking space, where the purpose of an insulating jacket is to keep you warm in camp and as a supplemental layer for your sleep system. And so a lot of people get so focused on that function that they're looking strictly at warmth to weight ratio and weather resistance of the jacket or wind resistance, and not realizing that this could add a lot of versatility to their on the move layering system as well.
Absolutely. You can just bring your wind shell and put it on top. And I almost always carry a wind shell when using an active insulation jacket. Yeah.
You've done this review with a dozen different manufacturers that are putting jackets onto the market. And then you have these little cottage guys. So you've got small manufacturers like Nunatac and Enlightened Equipment comes to mind. Both of those guys make lightweight synthetic insulated jackets. And they're competing with very polished, established brands like Patagonia and Arc'teryx. Is there room in the market for the little guys, and what can they be doing in order to serve the market better?
Yeah, so I think there definitely is room. And one of the things I think one of the key results from, this review is that some of these cottage company jackets are top of the line in terms of their performance. And so I think the main advantage that these cottage companies have is using either niche, typically very fragile fabrics, or in custom sizing and features. So I don't think they can compete with large manufacturers on having, let's say, like the best in class fabric. Like Nunatac, their fabrics are not, I don't think they compete with Patagonia's latest and greatest lightweight fabric because they can't buy the larger quantities and whatever else. So they're not quite as good. I think they're still perfectly good, but they're not as good. That's my take. And then they also can't compete with Patagonia and Arc'teryx design their own continuous filament insulations. The little guys can't do that. Similarly, they can't compete on the design, just this incredible tailoring of an Arc'teryx jacket is just marvelous. And so they can't compete in those areas, but they're really good for, I think, fit. Like Nunatac, you can basically get a custom made jacket to fit your body perfectly for less than or equal to the price of a competing jacket from Patagonia or Arc'teryx. And that's amazing. Like I have longer arms. I like a jacket that's a little bit longer. Like if I'm getting the Nunatac Skaha, I got mine with an extra 2 inches on the back, so it covers my butt a bit, and that adds so much more warmth. So to be able to get something custom like that is really, really great.
Yeah, you can't even get a tailored suit for that much. So that's pretty amazing. So you used that word continuous filament insulation. Can you describe that and then explain also the short staple insulation that you talk about in your report?
Yeah. So continuous filament is just a long strand of polyester that's then anchored on one end with, at a seam and then on another end. And that design, that tends to be more durable than short staple, which is a whole bunch of itty bitty fibers kind of, let's say, smashed, not really woven together, but just matted together. So continuous filaments, I think their main advantage is durability, and they also tend to be more hydrophobic. There's a whole bunch of different ways to assess the water resistance, let's say, properties with synthetic insulation. But the main thing is, we know that nothing is warm when it's wet. So really what matters most is how quickly does that water get out? And I think that with the continuous filament insulations, water tends to get out a little bit quicker. So on average, I think that a continuous filament insulation provides the best performance. Now it's getting a little bit tricky now that other companies are making different variations. So maybe you have one that's a little bit more durable for a very specific type of jacket, but generally speaking, that's I would say the gold standard.
So is there a perfect synthetic insulated jacket that doesn't yet exist? And if so, what does it look like to you?
Well, I don't think weights are going to drop a lot more. I think they'll come down some, but probably not by a huge amount. So I would be less focused on weight and more focused on comfort. And I think 2 areas for improvement are with stronger air permeable fabrics. I've been told that the fabric developers are more or less in in elementary school in terms of their knowledge of developing strong air permeable fabrics. They've done a great job at making fabrics really tightly woven and strong, but they haven't thought about, whoa, how can we make this thing, loosely knit and also strong? So that's one area for improvement. And the other is with more durable insulation. And, if anyone who's used synthetic insulated jackets for a while know that the insulation just degrades. And from a long-term value perspective, that's pretty terrible. Andrew Skirka, he's told me he doesn't even use synthetic insulated jackets because they're such a bad value. I think maybe his take might change now if he tries some of these active insulation jackets. But overall, I would go for a hooded, full zip active insulation jacket with a chest pocket, durable insulation, durable fabrics. And I would be fine if that weighed 10 ounces. I mean, the NanoAir Light is fantastic. Just making that a little bit more durable would be great.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit more about durability. So is there something that users can be doing to extend the life of their synthetic insulated jackets?
Compress it less.
Yeah, I know. For me, my synthetic puffy is always near the top of my packer at hand, and I very seldom, if ever, compress it tightly anytime, whether it's in storage at home or it's in my backpack. So this kind of confuses me, because if you got an insulating piece that you need available when you stop and rest, or if the weather turns south, then it should be in a fairly uncompressed state anyways, right?
Yeah, I guess it just depends on how tight your pack is packed. I mean, sometimes I'm things don't even fit in the pack and it's on top and everything is just jammed in as tight as possible. So
yeah, right. So maybe you need a bigger pack.
Get a bigger pack, carry more, and compress your jacket less.
Yeah, I mean, I'm being a little bit facetious, but this is actually a part of the ultralight ethos is allowing your insulation to fill the volume of a slightly larger backpack rather than trying to cram everything into, the latest SUL pack or something like that.
Yeah. And so I feel like compression is probably the key driver of degradation. I mean, it's not really an issue with fabrics. Depending on your activity, maybe you need a more durable fabric, but yeah, I think that's the main driver.
The other driver of durability for me that I've experienced through the years is sleeping in your insulated jacket, because as you roll around in your sleeping bag and you're creating pressure points and you're putting a lot of shear stress on that insulation as you roll and turn, and that may be an underappreciated method for degrading your jacket a little faster too.
That's a good tip.
Sure, it's the same thing, because sleeping on it is essentially compressing it.
Yeah, for sure.
I through using all these jackets, like I have the go-to tough jacket, which is the Arc'teryx Proton LT hoodie, and that thing is so much tougher than other ones. So I've used that a lot more just because it's tougher. It's not as comfortable, but I choose to wear it because I know that the fabric's tougher and the insulation's tougher. And then I don't ever wear any of those high performance jackets around town. I don't ever do that. So that helps too.
At what point do you decide that your jacket is done? It's no longer insulating you enough and it's time to retire it?
I would probably keep something for a really long time and use it less. But again, I think it all depends on what's the purpose of one of these insulating jackets. Is it to be warm or is it just to be comfortable? So I think I would be more likely to retire a low air permeability windproof jacket earlier than an active insulation jacket, because with an active insulation one, it'll just be less warm and then you can use it for more high output stuff. Or when the insulation truly dies, then you can cut the insulation out and just use it as a super light active insulation soft shell jacket like the Airshed.
Whenever I get a new jacket, I do a loft measurement on it. So I'll fold it over 2 or 3 or 4 times so I can get several layers of fabric to measure the loft. And then I'll note that in a notebook. And then over time, as the jacket's loft degrades and it gets thinner, I'll monitor that loft. And I usually find that once it hits less than 50% of its original loft, it's time for it to go and maybe replace it with something else. But I've noticed a few trends, and going back to your short staple versus continuous insulation options, the short staple stuff can reach that less than 50% of original loft point really, really fast, especially if you do compress it in a stuff sack or anything like that, or if you compress it wet. I found that compression while the fibers are wet is really hard on the insulation, and for some reason it causes damage to the fibers. And I pulled some of these fibers out of highly used jackets and looked at them under a stereoscope, and you can see they're just totally trash. They look nothing like new fibers. So, that loft measurement, loft monitoring is one way you could do it as well.
That's great.
So just one last question for you, Max. What are your big plans for 2018?
I've been pondering kind of this trip that I've wanted to do for a really long time would be to start on the road in Western Yukon Territory and then hike to the road in the middle of the Brooks Range in Alaska called the Dalton Highway. So it'd be across the Arctic Refuge and part of Canada. And climate, like right now I work with climate change. So I'd be really interested in doing what I'd call it a zero emissions traverse, trying to hitchhike up there and then hitchhike back down and not get any bush flights for a resupply. So that's what I've been thinking about. But honestly, it would be so heavy to hike across all that. I think it would just be really miserable to carry such a heavy pack for that long.
How heavy do you think it'll have to be?
Well, I would want to do it all hiking, and I would also want to go through like the bigger peaks in there, and ideally like hike up one of the 8,000 foot peaks. So we're looking at least 3 weeks minimum, very minimum. So 4 weeks. I don't know, honestly. I haven't really spent a lot of time with Google Earth.
Max, thanks so much for spending time with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation. I can't wait to see what you come up with for 2018, and I'll be following along.
Thanks so much. It's been great to be here.
You can follow Max online at his blog, maxneale.blogspot.com. That's Neale, where he posts trip reports and some amazing photography from his adventures. And Max's State of the Market report on synthetic insulated jackets is available now at backpackinglight.com/synthetic jackets.
So let's go ahead and take some listener questions about synthetic insulation. This one's from Roman in Germany. He says, you always read that synthetic insulation still insulates when wet compared with down. To what extent is this true? Last time I soaked my synthetic jacket, I did not feel that much insulation was left, but that, of course, was by no means scientific.
This is an interesting topic. Max noted it in his interview. Let me start that over. This is a kind of a loaded question. Max noted in the interview that nothing is warm when wet. And, I kind of agree with that. If you soak anything, it's not going to be warm, period. It's going to be cold because your body's got to drive that moisture out of the garment. So I think what we really are talking about is the loft maintained in response to small amounts of moisture? So let's say we have a 12-ounce down jacket and a 12-ounce synthetic insulated jacket, and then we add 2 ounces of moisture vapor that condenses inside the insulation to each jacket. The down's going to lose more loft than the synthetic. So in that respect, in response to a little bit of moisture, the synthetic will retain more loft, and the more loft that's retained, the better ability it has to entrap air that is used to then insulate your body. So in that respect, it's warmer when damp, but nothing's warm when wet. If you soak out a jacket, the fibers are going to collapse. You're going to lose the air retention ability, and you've lost all benefit of the insulating garment, whether it's down or synthetic. Where synthetic really shines in a soaking wet garment is that it's going to dry faster. If you try to wring out, let's say you submerge a down jacket and you submerge a synthetic jacket, wring them both out, shake them out. And when you're done with that process, that down jacket is going to be a clump of wet mess, and it is going to be the last thing you're going to want to put on. But I've done this with a synthetic jacket. I took a swim pack rafting on it. It was an accidental swim, but I was wearing a synthetic coat, so it got submerged. I got out, I wrung it out. I did not want to put it back on. It was not in wearable condition, but I put it on top of my pack and dried it out in the wind a bit. And after a couple hours, it was wearable because that moisture left the jacket. I would have never been able to do that with that down jacket. That down jacket would have been just as wet 24 hours later if I didn't have sun or something like that to warm it up.
What about a situation where you've gotten other layers wet and one conventional wisdom says, you can wear those wet clothes to bed and your body heat will dry them out. But then, that moisture has to go somewhere. And usually that means it goes right into either your synthetic or your down bag. So is there an advantage there to synthetic that sort of follows the same logic?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've experienced this firsthand numerous times using ultralight down quilts. And by ultralight down quilts, I mean those that have, 2 inches or less of loft to them. So these quilts are really sensitive to moisture. And so if you go to bed with wet clothing in a 40-degree rated down quilt, you're going to accumulate a ton of moisture in that quilt that will cause that quilt to lose a significant amount of loft. So you get up in the morning and then envision the scenario where you're stuffing the quilt into its stuff sack for the day, and you are basically putting a wet quilt that has very little insulating ability already into a compressed state. So now you're causing these wet fibers to compress against each other, to stick, and lo and behold, you pull that quilt out at the next night. At your next camp, and it's flat, and you're like, oh my gosh, I got to sleep in this tonight. And that process over the course of several days can absolutely destroy a down quilt. So yeah, it does impact. It has the same impacts in a quilt as it does in a jacket.
Well, that's a good segue into our next question, which is from Randy in Castle Rock. And he says, with the rise of water-resistant down, have the advantages of synthetic insulation been largely eliminated? And maybe a good place to start is a quick explanation of the technology behind water-resistant down, and then go into the question.
So there's various chemical technologies that are used to make down so-called water-resistant. And they're all based on the principle that down is a fairly hydrophilic or water-loving fiber. And so you run the down through a chemical process that coats the surface of the down plumule with a hydrophobic coating. And so now, instead of a water droplet absorbing into the fibers and causing it to collapse, the down fiber repels that water, causes it to beat up, and it doesn't cause the fiber to collapse. It generally works fairly well for low amounts of moisture, but it doesn't work for the high amounts of moisture that you might experience over the course of several days in a very cold environment. For example, if you were using an ultralight down quilt, or suffered from severe external moisture, like a dunking in a river or a steady rain, where you're wearing the garment and exposing it to continuous external moisture. Does it eliminate the need or the advantage of synthetic insulation? No. It's got potential to improve the quality of the down in mildly moist environments, but it doesn't change the use case scenario where a synthetic really shines in sustained wet environments where you don't have the opportunity to dry your insulation. What it does do is improve the down when it's humid, and it's good stuff, but it has not approached the hydrophobic nature of a synthetic insulation by any means.
Yeah, I mean, just to circle back around to Max's philosophy, there's a situation for everything, and there might be no one great answer that applies to every outdoor situation. Moving on to the next question. This is from Joel in Washington State, and he asks, which synthetic fiber insulation in its finished form inside the garment fabrics has the best ability to transport moisture vapor through it?
So this question is somewhat difficult to answer because we have these brands. We have Climate Shield Apex, and we have Primaloft Gold, and we have Patagonia Plumafil, and all these different things. And all of these things can be made in different bat constructions, fiber diameters, fiber densities, and all this kind of stuff. And you never really know how they perform because manufacturers aren't terribly forthcoming in publishing comparative test data on the kind of questions that we want answers to. So I have to answer this question based on principle. And the principle is that the bats that have the lowest fiber density, which by definition has the highest void space, are going to be the ones that are able to transmit the most moisture vapor through it. And that's a difficult thing to answer because all of these synthetic insulation manufacturers have low density and high density bats. And so it just depends. One other aspect is how the bat is constructed inside the garment. So if you look at the Patagonia Micropuff hoodie, it has these kind of semi-tubular bats that are oriented vertically in the jacket. And then between those bats, there's quite a bit of void space. And so that jacket is actually pretty breathable, even though it uses windproof fabrics. It allows a lot of moisture to be transported out the jacket while still maintaining some light insulating ability. So there's a case where the actual manufacturing of the garment creates a breathable environment versus the insulation type.
So here's a tip from Craig in Virginia, and Ryan, you might be able to elaborate on it a little bit. He says, I was a participant in the September 2017 Wilderness Adventures Trek in Montana that Backpacking Light put on. I wasn't prepared for the temperatures and snow that week. I brought a Sierra Designs dry down quilt. Ryan loaned me an Enlightened Equipment synthetic quilt to supplement mine. He taught me to layer the synthetic quilt over the down bag because the outer synthetic layer would better take on most of the condensation and my down bag would stay dry. It worked. I learned a valuable lesson about using an outer quilt with synthetic insulation on that trip. I think it would be nice to share this tip with others.
This is one of the most beneficial uses of synthetic insulation in my eyes, is in a very thin outer quilt that you can layer then over a down quilt or down sleeping bag. Now, Craig brought a dry down quilt. This is a hydrophobic down, treated down. And, my experience in the kinds of conditions that we had that week, which were temperatures right around freezing, snow, moist, there was no sun. It was just a damp environment for 4 straight days. And oftentimes guys who bring lightweight down quilts on a trip like that, by the time day 4 rolls around, they're ready to sleep in a hotel because their quilts are pretty flat. So here's a case where you can take a lightweight down bag, layer over it a synthetic quilt, and here's what's going to happen. You're going to bed. Your clothes are damp from exertion, physical exertion and perspiration throughout the day. They're damp from external moisture because it's been snowing. We're camping in snow. We're just getting wet, and we crawl in with damp clothing. That moisture throughout the night is evaporated by your body heat, and it's got to condense somewhere. Ideally, we'd like that moisture to leave our ultralight shelters and go out into the outside environment. Everything would be perfectly dry, but it doesn't work like that because as moisture vapor leaves your body, it travels through the sleep system. And there comes a point in the sleep system where it's going to get cold enough that moisture vapor is going to condense into moisture liquid water. That occurs at some point near the outer edge of your sleep system. So if you just have a down bag, that outer edge is usually right inside the outer shell of the sleeping bag. So now you've got this evaporated moisture condensing as liquid water inside the outer shell of your down bag. And so it's going to cause your down bag to lose its loft. If you take a synthetic outer quilt and layer it over your down bag, you push that condensation point out into the synthetic quilt and away from your down bag. So now the moisture is condensing as liquid inside the synthetic insulation rather than inside the down insulation. Your down bag stays dry, and your synthetic bag, by nature of synthetic insulation, can accommodate that moisture without losing a lot of loft. And so it's a great sleep system for cold conditions, taking a lightweight inner down bag and layering a synthetic outer bag over it. And I have a system that I've used extensively for the past couple of years, and I think it's a 10 ounce or 11 ounce Enlightened equipment down quilt. It's very, very light. I think it has a temperature rating of 50 degrees. And then I have a 50 degree rated synthetic outer quilt over it. And in combination, it has a comfortable lower temperature rating of about 30. So this is what I use for mountaineering trips or trips in wet environments in the spring and fall. And it's just a really good system that keeps that down always dry. And it's a good insurance sleep system.
What's the longest you've ever used that system consecutively? Like he was talking, you mentioned 4 or 5 day trips. Is this something you could maintain over, say, 2 weeks, a month, a through hike?
I would be totally confident using a system like this on an indefinitely long trek, a whole lot more confident than I would be using down alone, especially in an environment like, Max is up in Alaska, and you can be on a trek up there and experience weeks on end of no sunshine. This is the system I would take in a situation like that. A through hike, I don't know. I'd be more inclined to take a down bag on a through hike because you have the opportunity to dry it out every 4 or 5 days. Now, admittedly, my through hiking context is the Continental Divide and Pacific Crest Trails, which tend to be fairly dry compared to the AT. So I don't know what y'all would select over on the AT where it rains more. Okay, the next segment of this podcast is simply called Gear, where we feature a piece of gear that we've recently reviewed or are otherwise in the process of reviewing. And this episode's featured gear is the Tarp Tent Notch Lithium. We've been reviewing this shelter for the last few weeks, and it's undergoing a long-term review right now. And that shelter review is available at backpackinglight.com. We'll link to that in the show notes. And yeah, so this is a 20 ounce Cuban fiber full double wall solo tent with 2 doors and 2 vestibules. What do you think about that, Andrew? Is this something that you would be interested in?
Oh yeah, definitely. I had a tarp tent. I have a tarp tent. I bought it in 2012. It's sil nylon. So I'm particularly interested in hearing about the Cuban fiber and how that changes the nature of this tent.
Yeah. So the primary benefits, I think, of Cuban fiber are it has a lower stretch. So sil nylon and polyester is even worse, but sil nylon is kind of famous for, you pitch your tent tight in the evening, go to bed, you have declining temperatures or rain, and you wake up in the morning and it's all sagging. Oh. And that's just the nature of the physical properties of nylon. Cuban fiber has less stretch to it, and so it expands and contracts less in response to temperature change. So it tends to hold its shape better through what we call a declining temperature event. So that's one benefit I really like about Cuben fiber. The other one, obviously, is that it has a pretty high tear strength for its weight, and you can make a shelter that's quite a bit lighter. So I think in the Notch, the Cuben fiber version, and I shouldn't say Cuben fiber anymore, should I? It's Dyneema composite fibers, DCF now. So the DCF version of the Notch is, a half pound lighter than the sil nylon version. So it definitely has the ability to save a substantial amount of weight in a shelter like this.
A half pound, that's amazing.
The other thing that Cuben fiber is probably beneficial for is condensation resistance, and it has to do with the emissivity of the fabric itself, which means that it loses less heat loss to radiation. I think I'm not an emissivity expert, but the idea here is that a DCF tent is going to condense less moisture on the inside of its walls than a sil nylon tent. And anecdotally, I've certainly experienced that.
Tarp tents are kind of known for being roomy. Does that hold true with this tent?
I'm not a big guy. I'm 5'7". I use a regular sized, 20-inch wide sleeping pad, regular length, and an air mattress, a 2.5-inch thick air mattress in a 20 by 72 dimension fits just fine in there. I put in a large one, something like 25 inches wide by, I think it's 78 inches long. And it definitely does not fit into the floor footprint of the tent. It causes some of the sides to scrunch out a little bit, but it's manageable. So I could see this tent working for a tall person who's also on a wide sleeping pad. It's just not a perfect fit, but I don't think it's going to impact the performance of the tent at all by putting a big pad in there.
Yeah, I guess I should say I'm 5'6", so roomy is definitely a subjective term for me.
Yeah. One of the things I do like about it is that there's lots of headroom. And so, for me personally, being short, I can sit up in it just fine. And I think someone who's 6 feet or 6'2" is going to be able to sit up in the tent as well without, brushing their head on it. But because the tent peaks at the middle of the tent and then slopes down to the edges, when you're sleeping or laying down, there's not a lot of headroom right above your face. But it's not claustrophobic feeling like a bivy tent or anything like that.
You said it had 2 doors?
2 doors, 2 vestibules, which I love because I like organizing my gear or stowing wet stuff in one vestibule and then using the other one for entry, exit, or cooking or making coffee or whatever.
Well, you recently took the tent to Canyonlands. How'd that work out?
Yeah, it worked out great. I have the inner tent for the Notch lithium that is partially fabric, and much of my camping is in desert environments down here on the Colorado Plateau or snow, and I wanted the solid inner fabric to protect against blowing snow and spindrift and blowing sand in the desert. And so that's the inner tent that I took down with me. And we experienced horrendous winds, probably one of the worst storms I've ever experienced in the desert. And we had wind gusts that were, up to 50 miles an hour on a very regular basis, several times through the night. And so it's not a perfect inner tent because we did have a lot of sand get into the tent still because there is a bit of mesh. The roof of the inner tent is still mesh and the upper portion of the walls are still mesh. So sand still got in, and I imagine snow is going to get in there too when we test it in a blowing snow environment. But it helped a lot. And compared to using a full mesh inner tent, which would have had so much sand in it, it wouldn't even been funny. It did help a lot. So, we got to put it through the test in some very high winds, and I'll reserve the details for the full review, but I will say that this is a light shelter. It's 20 ounces. So this is not a tent that's really designed for really stormy conditions. When you have winds that are 30 plus miles an hour, these are big winds. And in the desert where you have no shelter and you're completely exposed to it, the tent is being hammered by these winds. So the notch does not have zippered doors. It's 2 overlapping flaps, and they are secured by Velcro strips and a little clip at the bottom of the flaps where the door guy line is guyed out to a stake. So high winds can, blow these doors open, and they did. And so that is definitely one of the limitations to this design in severely windy environments. And this was a fairly dry storm. It didn't have a lot of rain, just a lot of wind. So it wasn't a huge deal to crawl out of the tent and reaffix the doors every time they blew open. But it happened often through the night as this storm kind of raged. So, that's one of the limitations of saving weight by going to an alternative door closure like this. But boy, it was a lot more secure than a tarp would have been. That's for sure.
Oh, no kidding. So what's the next step as you continue to explore this tent?
So, one of the benefits of living in Laramie, Wyoming is we have access to one of the finest wind labs in the nation, not very far from here. And so we're going to take this tent and really look at it in the wind and do some slow motion video and see how the wind is actually placing stress on different parts of the tent and things like that. I also have the new version of the notch in sil nylon. So we're going to do side-by-side testing with both of those, especially with respect to condensation resistance, and see how they compare. So yeah, those are the two main things we're going to look at here shortly.
That's cool. When can we expect to see that?
Well, I'm going to, it's still winter up here. I live at 7,000 feet, and we just had some of our biggest snowstorms of the season. So I'm looking forward to getting that out as a winter tent, because it's built as kind of a 3+ season tent. But I'm really curious to see how it truly performs in a winter blizzard situation. So I'm going to wait until we have that data first. And then I want to do some long-term use with the tent in an extended backpacking context. So I really get a feel for the usability of the design, and to see if these doors are really a problem or if it was just annoying to me in Canyonlands. And so I want to be fair about this. And I think in order to write a fair review, you got to spend some time with the shelter. So I'm going to probably update the existing review sometime in the next 4 to 6 weeks, as soon as we get a couple more short trips with it. And then I'm going to use it through the summer and then post a long-term review in the fall.
Fantastic. Well, looking forward to it. So now it's time for our Here and Now segment, where we share a little bit about what we're currently studying, learning about, testing, or planning when it comes to our backpacking gear, skills, and activities. So Ryan, what do you have on your plate right now?
I am in the middle of planning a trip to the Boulder White Cloud Wilderness up in northern Idaho. This is a brand new wilderness that was designated in 2015. It's a number of wilderness areas that are kind of form this 275,000 acre wilderness complex. And I've been going to North Idaho for the last several years, every summer. And Stephanie and I have been doing some hikes up there and just kind of exploring the area. And Chase has had this summer classical music festival that he attends there. So we've really gotten to fall in love with this region of the country. And we're going back this year. And I'm looking to do a longer trip there, probably 7 or 8 days with a group of friends, and going to spend much of our time off trail and try to do a loop through the White Clouds area.
That sounds great. Well, I am right in the middle of working on a big article about the Organ Mountain Desert Peaks National Monument just outside of Las Cruces, New Mexico, that I'm doing for Backpacking Light. And it's been a lot of fun because it's a huge monument and there's so much to do. So I've been fat biking. I've looked at some archaeological sites, some native heritage sites. There's some interesting geological stuff out here. There's a big volcanic crater, and then just some beautiful scenery in the Chihuahuan Desert. I live in El Paso right now, and as an East Coast boy, this is just almost an alien landscape for me. Hiking in the Smoky Mountains, there's these gentle sort of dew-dropped leaves and rhododendron and tunnels of mountain laurel. And, out here in the Chihuahuan Desert, basically everything is trying to kill you. It's a real change of pace. Everything has thorns. Everything will bite you if you touch it. So it's fun to explore.
So it's called Oregon Mountains Desert Peaks. So tell me about the peaks side of the desert here, because this is, we have the Colorado Plateau is characterized primarily by desert canyons. And then on the fringe of the plateau, there's large mountain ranges that are typical temperate snowy mountain ranges. So what's the desert peaks like? What's that environment like?
So if you can imagine a flat expanse of desert and then with really prominent mountains just kind of jutting right out of it. We don't get above 7,000 feet in elevation. So every now and then there'll be a little dusting of snow up there, certainly nothing like what you would see in some of the higher ranges in the Sierras or the Rockies, but really interesting prominence. And they're really ancient mountains. They have a real sense of age to them. They're worn down, and then, they're kind of speckled with petroglyphs and archaeological sites. So you really get a sense of the age of the place and just how long, some of these native tribes have been here or passed through the area.
That's so cool. I've never even heard of this place until you proposed writing about it. So I'm very eager to see your pictures and your writing from your trips there.
Yeah, just a little bit of background. It's a monument designation that was created, I believe, 2015. I don't have my research right in front of me, but obviously during the Obama years. And it's currently one of the monuments, along with Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante, that are up for review by the Trump administration. It's kind of a unique story. I won't go into it too much, but it's a very community-driven monument, and I'm really excited about telling its story.
Very cool. I love hearing about new places like this. Okay, well, now it's time for BPL News, where we highlight current events and activities at the backpackinglight.com website. First up, we have a calendar that we have now published online. You can see it at backpackinglight.com/calendar. And there we're going to post our editorial plans for the future, as well as our activities and events. So I want to highlight a couple of those events that are coming up. The first is we are launching a new webinar series that's focused on instructional skills. So on March 29th, we'll hold our first webinar, and that will be on synthetic insulation. We'll dive much deeper into the science and applications of synthetic insulation than what we did today. And the enrollment for that webinar will open on March 25th, which is probably the day this podcast drops. So you can find more information about enrolling in that webinar at backpackinglight.com/webinar. At the end of April, we'll have our second webinar. The topic will be Dyneema composite fabrics, or Cuban fiber, and we'll talk about the science behind manufacturing that fabric and its applications in everything from garments to shelters. And that webinar will be scheduled in a couple of weeks, so stay tuned on the calendar and look for a hard date as that one gets ready to go. So these webinars will be free to unlimited members and available for a very low price to others who are interested in learning about gear, skills, and technology in much more detail than what we can provide in a short article or a brief podcast like this. April 1st is going to be our deadline for Wilderness Adventures track enrollments for our June guides course, which is either full or almost full. I can't remember. And the Sundance and Timberline tracks that are occurring in July, August, and September. And I know those are almost all sold out, and September might already be sold out. And if you're interested in attending one of these treks, we hold them up in Montana, and they're out of a little town called Red Lodge, very quaint terrific little mountain town, and we do them up on the Beartooth Plateau in the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness. More information is at backpackinglight.com/treks. On April 4th, we are opening submissions to the backpackinglight.com Film Festival, and you can go to backpackinglight.com/ff if you want information on submitting a film for that festival. If you missed last year's festival, you can catch the entire event on YouTube as a recorded live stream. And we'll be holding this year's festival also in Fort Collins, Colorado. And we'll be doing a live stream again sometime in November, and we'll announce that date as we finalize our plans.
And this is the second year of the festival, correct?
It is, correct. Yeah. So we're going for it. We had a very successful festival last year, and a lot of excitement generated around it. And so we're really looking forward to it again.
Awesome. I can't wait.
In website news, we're getting ready to launch an update to the website that will include a much more refined navigation menu that will be mobile responsive, and we'll install some long-awaited forum bug fixes and updates. So you can look for that sometimes towards the end of April. You can follow our website update page at backpackinglight.com/BPL track. That's BPLTRAC. So yeah, that's it for news. Lots going on right now.
Very cool. Well, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this podcast. This podcast is brought to you by backpackinglight.com, which has been providing information and education about lightweight wilderness travel since the year 2000. So the Backpacking Light podcast is supported by subscription fees paid by our loyal website subscribers, and we're extremely grateful for your support. A backpackinglight.com subscription can save you time and money on your quest to lighten your pack weight, spend more time in the outdoors, and connect with a community of like-minded hikers. So if you aren't yet a backpackinglight.com subscriber, please consider subscribing and gain access to nearly 1 million forum posts, 4 million words of original content, more than 2,000 articles, and access to our wilderness adventure trekking programs. You can subscribe online right now at backpackinglight.com/subscribe. So please consider doing that and help us continue to bring this podcast to you. If you have feedback, questions, or tips for our listeners, please share them via email at podcast@backpackinglight.com. That's podcast@backpackinglight.com. To download the show notes for this episode, visit backpackinglight.com/podcast. This podcast is available on iTunes. Please leave us a review. It helps other people find the show. Thanks for listening to the first episode of the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one parting message, it's this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the